Trap starts with pawn to e4, and black answers with pawn to e5. After knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4, we enter the Italian game. But instead of instantly playing knight to d4 like in the Blackburn-Schilling gambit, black waits a couple of moves before striking. First, black develops with knight to f6, and if white goes for knight to g5, they are clearly aiming for the fried liver attack. Rather than worrying about it, black responds confidently with pawn to d5, attacking both the bishop on c4 and the pawn on e4. White captures on d5, and here, instead of taking back immediately or choosing the standard knight to a5 line, black introduces the tricky Fritz variation with knight to d4. A lot of players are unfamiliar with this setup. White often believes black has made a mistake because the move knight takes f7 looks extremely tempting, forking the queen on d8 and the rook on h8. But the important detail is that white's bishop on c4 is blocked and cannot properly support the knight. Next, white naturally pushes pawn to d6, trying to reopen the diagonal for the bishop on c4 and bring back the threat. Black calmly replies with queen takes d6, seemingly unconcerned about the attack. White then confidently grabs material with knight takes f7, thinking they are winning. But this is where the real trap begins. Black's queen slides to c6, starting a dangerous counterattack that can completely change the game. This line surprises many opponents and can quickly become devastating if white is not extremely careful. Now white captures the rook on h8. At first glance, it seems like black's position is collapsing and everything is going wrong. But suddenly the attack comes alive. Black plays queen takes g2, attacking white's rook on h1 from across the board. Once again, the same tactical theme appears on the board. If white moves the rook on h1 away, black follows up with a crushing queen check. The exact same pattern repeats itself, and if white tries to block the queen with a piece, black simply captures it, wins more material, and completely punishes the mistake. If white instead blocks with bishop to g2, then the position becomes hopeless. Black finishes the game with knight to f3, locking the king on e1 together with the queen on g2. With no squares left to escape, it becomes a beautiful, smothered checkmate. The Stafford Gambit trap features a brilliant 8-move checkmate and an amazing queen sacrifice. White begins with pawn to e4, and black responds with pawn to e5. After knight to f3, instead of simply protecting the pawn, black plays knight to f6, entering the Petrov defense. White captures on e5 with the knight, and black counters with knight to c6, offering the Stafford Gambit. After the exchanges, black sacrifices a pawn but gains rapid development and dangerous attacking chances. White plays pawn to d3, reinforcing the center, and black develops naturally with bishop to c5. But if white makes the serious mistake of playing bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6, they suddenly walk straight into a deadly trap. Black immediately strikes with knight takes e4, completely ignoring the pin on the knight. If white greedily grabs the queen on d8, thinking they have won material, black responds with the brilliant move bishop takes f2 check. The king has only one legal move forward, and then bishop to g4 delivers checkmate. Black's pieces coordinate perfectly, leaving no escape squares. The Lasker trap includes one of the craziest underpromotions you will ever see in the opening. White starts with pawn to d4, and black responds with pawn to d5. After pawn to c4, entering the queen's gambit, black counters aggressively with pawn to e5, beginning the Albin counter gambit. White accepts with pawn takes e5, and black immediately pushes pawn to d4. White continues with pawn to e3, attempting to eliminate the advanced pawn. Here black strikes with bishop to b4 check. White has very few choices and usually blocks with bishop to d2. Rather than exchanging bishops, black sacrifices the bishop and continues with pawn takes e3. White thinks black has blundered and happily captures the bishop, but this is exactly what black wanted. The position is now completely winning. From here, accuracy is everything. One careless move and the attack can disappear instantly. Black begins with bishop takes f2 check, attacking the king on e1 while also targeting the queen on d1. If white immediately captures the bishop, black simply wins the queen and gets a huge advantage. If white plays king to e2 to stay defended, the position becomes more complex. Black continues with bishop to g4, skewering the king and queen. If white captures the bishop, black simply wins the queen and takes control. White also has the defensive resource knight to f3, blocking the attack and escaping danger, keeping the position playable. To prevent this, black first removes the knight on g1. Instead of promoting to a queen, which would allow simplification, black underpromotes to a knight with check, forcing the king to move immediately. After this, bishop to g4 hits again, and the king and queen are once more skewered. White is forced to move, black captures the queen, and black emerges with a decisive material advantage. The fishing pole trap is a clever opening idea that can punish white very quickly if they are not careful. White opens with pawn to e4, and black responds with pawn to e5. After knight to f3 attacking the pawn on e5, black defends with knight to c6. White develops the bishop to b5, entering the Ruy Lopez. Instead of the usual lines, black chooses the Berlin defense with knight to f6. White castles normally, continuing development, but black now plays the surprising move knight to g4. At first this move looks strange because both the h2 and f2 pawns are already protected, but once white naturally tries to chase the knight away with pawn to h3, black boldly responds with pawn to h5, refusing to retreat the knight at all. A lot of players fall for the bait and take your knight on g4, believing they have simply won a free piece. But in reality, white is already in serious trouble. You immediately recapture with pawn takes knight on g4, attacking the knight on f3 at the same time. If white decides to move the knight on f3, you continue with queen to h4, creating a deadly attack that cannot be stopped. If white captures with the knight on g4, then queen to h1 becomes a beautiful checkmate. If white instead captures using the queen on g4, then queen takes h2 is immediate checkmate. And if white attempts to defend with pawn to f4 or pawn to f3, you should stay patient and not rush to capture anything. Your attack remains overwhelming, and checkmate cannot be avoided. This is an extremely dangerous trap that can finish the game quickly if white plays carelessly. You can now force checkmate with pawn to g3, taking away the king's final escape square. White is forced to move the rook because it is their only chance to survive. But then you continue with the deadly move knight to d4, shutting down the king's last remaining square. Without this move, the king might still escape, but now it is completely boxed in. After that, you simply capture, the king is forced to move, and queen to h1 finishes the game with checkmate. White can only watch in frustration while you celebrate the victory. The Noah's Ark trap starts from the classic Ruy Lopez opening. White begins with pawn to e4, and you reply with pawn to e5. After knight to f3 attacks the pawn on e5, you defend with knight to c6. White develops the bishop to b5, and you respond with pawn to a6, forcing the bishop back to a4. You strengthen the center with pawn to d6, and when white tries to challenge it, you push pawn to d4. Now the trap begins. First, you play pawn to b5, forcing the bishop to retreat again to b3. With the bishop running out of safe squares, you strike in the center with knight takes d4. White responds with knight takes d4, and after pawn takes knight on d4, white often instinctively recaptures with queen takes d4, thinking the position is completely fine. But that move walks directly into the trap. After white plays queen takes d4, you immediately continue with pawn to c5, attacking the queen and trapping the bishop at the same time. If white moves the queen to c4, the bishop no longer has any escape squares, and you win the piece for free. However, white also has a tricky resource with queen to d5, attacking your rook at the same time. You cannot ignore this move, or your rook will fall. But black is still clearly winning after bishop to e6, attacking the queen while also protecting the rook. White now struggles to find any useful move. They may try a desperate check, but you calmly answer with bishop to d6, defending the rook once again. Afterward, the queen is forced to move away, and now you are threatening checkmate. The bishop remains trapped, and the game becomes an easy win for black.